Hello and welcome to today's poetry lesson on structure and pattern. Today we're going to be looking at using rhythm and meter in your poetry, as well as certain fixed form types of poetry that use rhythm and meter. There's some essential vocabulary you're going to want to know by the end of this lesson. I'm going to go over what a syllable is, what emphasis is, meter, rhythm. There's several different types of rhythm that really you should know that they exist. You probably don't need to memorize what an iamb, a trochee, an anapest, a dactyl, and a sponde is, but you should be able to look them up and find those definitions and have a good idea of what they mean. This will all tie into the idea of scansion. And then I'll look at free verse poems, stanzaic poems, fixed form poems of the sonnet and the villanelle, and the concept of anaphora. And so I have to have a disclaimer here. Scansion and looking at rhythm and meter in poetry is not one of my strong subjects. I'm not entirely certain I do it that well. There are other people who do it much better than I do, and they have videos online available for you to look at these things. I am a free verse poet. I typically don't use rhythm and meter that well or use them that often. And so really, there are other people who are going to have quite a bit more experience handling this subject than me. That being said, I can give you the introduction, but if you're really interested in this subject, I would recommend exploring some of the other videos available to you online. And so the first thing we need to discuss is the concept of having syllables in words, right? And so words can often be broken into individual sound clusters, right? And so if we have the word like syllable, that is actually three different clusters. It's si, la, and bul, right? Those are the syllables that make up the word syllable, right? Syllable. In elementary school, they probably had like the hand clapping thing to see where the different sounds in the words were. And so it's important when you're using really kind of metered poetry or fixed verse poetry to be able to identify and count your syllables. And so the word poetry, right, has three syllables, poetry. The word poem only has one syllable, right? And so it's just, you can always remember this because a syllable always has at least one vowel sound. And so if there's not another vowel sound, it's probably just one syllable. Like if we look at the word poetry, po, the O is the vowel sound. In et, the et is the vowel sound. And in the re, the E, and even though it's represented by a Y, is a vowel sound. And so every syllable has at least one vowel sound, or you can just do the poetry clapping method of trying to find these out. Also, a little pro tip, which I'll discuss later, every dictionary shows you where the syllables of a word are. And so let's take a look at some words. The word poet, how many syllables does it have? Poet, right? 2. Stanza, stanza, right? That's 2 syllables. Really, you can't look at the number of letters in English and get an idea of where the syllables are, because you could have, in English, you could have a word that's like 6 letters long and it's still just 1 syllable. And then you can have a word that's like 4 letters long and have it be 2 syllables. There's really no standard way to do this, right? The word metaphor, metaphor, right? That's 3 syllables long. Ineffable, ineffable, 4 syllables long. Alliteration, alliteration. That's 5 syllables long. It's a 5-syllable word. Imagery is 3. The word line, line, 1 syllable. Even though you notice that there's another vowel at the end, we don't actually pronounce that vowel. So if it was liney, it would be 2 syllables, but that's not how we pronounce line. And finally, apostrophe. That is 4 syllables. And so the reason why we look at this is there's certain fixed forms that require a certain amount of syllables per line. And if you get this lesson, you can write most fixed form poetry. But there is another thing that we have to take into account if you want to write really traditional poetry. And that is emphasis. This is where the lesson gets really difficult, right? Especially if English is not necessarily your first language. I don't know if this is harder for people whose first language was English or people whose first language was not English. I know I'm a native English speaker, and I sometimes have a hard time figuring this out, right? And so the thing you want to notice is that English words are not spoken evenly. Some syllables have emphasis or stresses, whereas other syllables do not, right? And so you don't want to put the emphasis on the wrong syllable, right? If you do, you would say, don't put the emphasis on the wrong syllable, right? And it almost sounds like we're not saying the same words, and all I've done is change the emphasis. I put the emphasis on the wrong syllable, and now it doesn't sound like I'm saying emphasis and syllable, right? That's how tied to stress and emphasis our language is, where if somebody mispronounces it, it's going to be wrong. One of the examples I heard online is Italians will typically pronounce the word spatula, right? And there the emphasis is put on a different syllable, and it makes it almost sound unrecognizable as a word. And this can be really frustrating for English speakers because they know the word, they're saying it with all the letters and sounds correct, but they're putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. And people are like, what word did you just say? And so it can be really frustrating. Now, there are several techniques for this. You can just kind of listen to the word and see which part of the word gets like the longest piece of it. So emphasis, right? The stressed syllable tends to take longer to say. The other way you could possibly try this is to just mispronounce the word. If you were to say emphasis or emphasis, emphasis, and you try and say it wrong, and if you find out which syllables it's not, typically you can figure out which one it is. There are tutorials to help you with this. I'm not actually going to require you to get the correct emphasis on anything, and I'm not going to test you on whether or not you know the emphasis, but as a poet, as somebody who's studying poetry, this is something you should be aware of, and it's something that may come into play if you want to write certain types of poetry. And so worst comes to worst, you can't figure out the emphasis. You can just open the dictionary, right? And so here we have two words, right? The noun record versus the verb record, right? And so if you notice on the little pronunciation areas here, you can see on the dictionary, it shows you the two syllables, record. But here it has this little apostrophe here, and the apostrophe is right in front of the stressed syllable. So when we use the noun form of record, RE is stressed. When we use the verb form, record, the cord is what's stressed, right? We have the little syllable right here in front of it. And so if you absolutely need to know the stress of a word and where the stress is located, you can look it up in the dictionary. However, that's not something I'm going to require, although I know some of you are very into fixed poetry, fixed form poetry, and you may want to write a truly Elizabethan sonnet that uses a very specific rhythm that I'll talk about in a minute. And so this might be something that you want to pursue. By and large, I think most of the people in this class are going to be free verse poets, and so this really won't come into play quite as much as it does for the people who are writing fixed form. And so what we look at when we're speaking, though, is that there are certain rhythms that occur when we're speaking, right? And there's a little key here that shows the rhythm, right? The slash is the stressed syllable or the emphasized syllable, and the dash is the unstressed syllable, right? And so when you have a word or multiple words in a row where it's unstressed, stressed, that's what's called an iamb or iambic. And so the example would be like invite, right? So the in is kind of less stressed, and then the vite is more stressed, right? There's trochee, which is stressed followed by unstressed. Deadline, right? It's not deadline, it's deadline. Unstressed, stressed is anapest, to the beach. Stressed, unstressed is what's called a dactyl, frequently. Or two stressed syllables in a word together are what are called spondy, true blue, right? Both those words are stressed. Now, once again, am I going to be testing you on this? I am not. But as somebody who is taking poetry seriously, you want to know that these things exist, and you want to know generally, if somebody's talking about iambs or iambic, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables in a word. And so we have this poem by John Keats, and we'll take a look, and we can see. Let's see if we can find the rhythm in it. He writes, "Seasons of mist and mellow fruitfulness, close bosomed friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatched eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed covered cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more, and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has overbrimmed their clammy cells." All right, and so I don't read it on rhythm because I honestly don't even think about rhythm. But if somebody were to read this in the rhythm, really accentuated, it would really get that kind of da-dump, 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 da-dump kind of rhythm to it, right? And this, if you're somebody who's like looking into maybe writing lyrics or rapping, the rhythm of the words does really actually matter to you. And so it's not just people who necessarily want to write old fixed form versions of poetry. Some other people who are into kind of more musical poetry or rapping, this is something that you would eventually want to put some effort into learning. And so if we look at this poem, "To Autumn," to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells, right? What would we look at here? Where are the syllables? And when you take a poem and you look for where there are stresses and no stresses, this is a process called scansion, which I'll talk about more in a minute. But if we look at it, you'll see that there's what are called feet. I'm skipping all over the place. I told you guys this isn't my subject, right? And so there are 5 poetic feats, right? Feet. And each one is an unstressed followed by a stressed. Unstressed, stressed. To swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells. And it creates that kind of da-dun, 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 da-dun rhythm. And this is what is called iambs, right? If we go back to the chart, these are poetic feats. And so each one is a poetic feat. Typically, they're little chunks of 2. You can have groups of 3 syllables in a foot, but typically it's 2. And so here, it has 5 groups of 2. And there's actually a specific name for this, right? And so each of those feet determine the rhythm, and there's a name for how many feet are in a line of poetry. And so if there's 1 foot in a line, it's called monometer. If there are 2, it's dimeter. Trimeter is 3, tetrameter is 4, pentameter is 5, hexameter is 6, heptameter is 7, octameter is 8. It could probably go up even more, right? So that's how many feet there are. And so there's a little formula for referring to the rhythm of a poem, right? You take the name of the foot, such as dactyl, and put an IC. Dactylic trimeter would equal that the poem is written in dactylic trimeter, right? Anapestic tetrameter would be anapestic tetrameter, right? Iambic pentameter would be iambic pentameter. Now, this might be a word you've heard of because iambic pentameter is like the English rhythm. It's like a classic rhythm from a lot of English poetry, particularly the sonnets, which I'll talk about more, right? But just this process of looking at a poem and figuring out what the feet are and figuring out what the meter is a process called scansion. Now, I'm never going to test you on this. This is for your knowledge, and if this is something that you want to pursue and explore more knowledge in, by all means, go ahead. The thing I want you to take away from this is I want you to start paying attention to the number of syllables in a line. Because even if you're just paying attention to the number of syllables in a line, you're getting closer to creating that meter and rhythm. But once again, if you're one of those people who wants a highly musical or a highly kind of very straight like beat to your poems, this is something you're going to want to put some effort into learning. And so we have this poem by George Herbert, and let's see if we can figure out let's perform some scansion on this poem and see if we can figure out what the meter and rhythm of the poem is, right? Is it written in dactylic trimeter? Is it written in iambic pentameter? What is it, right? Sweet day, so cool, so calm, so bright, the bridal of the earth and sky. The dew shall weep thy night to fall, for thou must die. Sweet rose, whose hue angry and brave bids the rash gazer wipe his eye, thy root is ever in its grave, and thou must die. Sweet spring, full of sweet days and roses, a box where sweets compacted lie, my music shows ye have your closes, and all must die. Only a sweet and virtuous soul, like seasoned timber, never gives, but through the whole world turned to coal, then chiefly lives, though not through. But anyway, so you might have noticed that there are points in there where I actually start feeling the rhythm and pronouncing on the rhythm. But the first thing you can take a look at is just take a look at how many syllables are there, right? Sweet day, so cool, so calm, so bright. This first line is really nice because each word is one syllable. So we have here 8 syllables, right? And so if I were to guess and perform scansion, I would say that this is tetrameter, right? That there's going to be 4 feet. And then it seems to be sweet day, so cool, so calm, so bright, right? And so here it seems to be an unstressed followed by a stressed. And so I would probably call this iambic tetrameter. But let's take a closer look, right? Here we can see once again, I've separated the lines and I've shown the emphasis. And we can see it's unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. And so this would be iambic because it's iambs are the unstressed, stressed pattern. And tetrameter because there's 4 feet per line. And so that's scansion for you, right? And so once again, I want to reiterate. If you're writing one of the more structured forms of poetry, you're going to run into the need to write a certain rhythm. If you are very interested in writing rap or lyrics and the rhythm of what you are writing is important to you, then this is something that could be extremely helpful. However, a free verse poet does not need a specified rhythm and really doesn't need this knowledge to write poems. They will write their poems without ever thinking about rhythm or meter, right? Or even rhyme. And so, but even though that's true, it doesn't mean you shouldn't know that this stuff exists. You should be aware that this is something that has traditionally been a part of poetry. It's something that can add a certain musicality to your poetry. And it's good to have like just in the back of your mind that this is something that you could pursue if you really want to work on making your poetry more, just more rhythmical. But that being said, odds are you're never going to need to use this, and it's going to be very limited in how I require you to have it in my class. So let's move on and take a look at some of the other ways that we might use structure. And so the first way that you might add structure to your poem is by putting rhythm and meter, writing in iambic pentameter, writing in spondaic monometer. I really don't know. Not my subject. Watch other YouTube videos to find more on this if it really interests you. It is a worthwhile pursuit in some cases. But there are some other forms that could be really useful. And so just because your poem doesn't have rhythm and meter doesn't mean it can't be organized. And one of the most useful ways to organize your poem is what's called stanzaic form. And this means that you have some kind of structure regarding your stanzas. Typically, there's some kind of even measure to all of your stanzas. Maybe all your stanzas are 4 lines long. And all of your stanzas are 2 really long lines that rhyme and followed by 1 much shorter line. It could be any kind of organization you want, but it really uses the stanzas to create a specific organization. If we look at Gwendolyn Brooks' We Real Cool, you can see she has a specific organization in her stanzas. And so it starts off, the pool players, 7 at the golden shovel. We recool. Let's start over. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon. And actually, we could read this a little bit different. If I were to say the pool players, seven at the Golden Shovel, we recool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon, right? You could read it that way if you really want to take the line break seriously and change the rhythm of it. And there is definitely a rhythm to this poem, right? But you can see the main feature is that Gwendolyn Brooks is writing in these organized stanzas of two lines, right? And so, really, the main organization here is that she's using the stanzas to create like this kind of measured thing. And so, this is one thing to consider. You may pay attention to how many lines are in each of your stanzas to create some kind of organization, and it's really up to you what you want to do. But if we want to get into like really, really specific forms of poetry that have rules and expectation, we want to look into what are called fixed forms. And so we're going to look at two specific fixed forms, the sonnet and the villanelle. But there are other fixed forms you may have heard of, such as haiku. I'm sure most of you know what a haiku is, a limerick, or a sestina. And so the sonnet is really kind of the classic English poem. It's Shakespeare's really well known for writing these. And so this is a 14-line poem that has 3 4-line stanzas, also called quatrains, and a 2-line stanza at the end called a couplet. It's called a rhyming couplet. It has a very specific rhyme pattern where it's A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. And then it's written in iambic pentameter. So it is written with a series of 5 iambs per line. So that's 5 unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. That being said, pretty much what I'm going to look for when I grade these and when I look for your examples, I want to see, did you put 10 syllables in the line? That's going to be the thing that really kind of I'm going to look at, because I'm not going to be like, oh, they didn't write an iambic pentameter. I don't think it's really something you need to be doing. But if you really want to challenge yourself and make a solid Elizabethan sonnet, you can write an iambic pentameter. Otherwise, you can just make 10 syllables. And so what it looks like is this, right? This is Sonnet 130 by William Shakespeare. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses I see in her cheeks. And in some perfume there is more delight than there is there in. See, this is where, if you miss like a single syllable, it kind of ruins the whole sonnet. So I'm sorry, guys, but I'm going to go anyway. There in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. And so here, a couple things we can see, despite my atrocious reading of that sonnet, is we have 4 stanzas of 4, or 3 stanzas of 4 lines. That's 4 stanzas total, right? So 4 lines, 4 lines, 4 lines, and a rhyming couplet, right? The rhyme pattern is A B A B. So sun and dun rhyme, whereas red and head rhyme. White and delight rhyme, cheeks and reeks rhyme. Know and go, sound and ground, and then rare and compare. This is really the main thing about sonnets. And if you look at this, you'll see also that each line is 10 syllables long. My mistress eyes are nothing like the sun. Each line will be 10 syllables, which is why if you don't read a sonnet specifically and you add or take away a word, you immediately lose the rhythm. And so this is a really famous form of English poetry that if you're going to be a poet, you need to know how to write a sonnet. It's just one of those things that, people will be like, oh, you don't know the most famous form of poetry in the English language, you want to know what it is. And so this is really what a sonnet consists of. Now, what you'll see here in this poem, you'll notice that Shakespeare's talked about my mistress, right? And so that's typically, it could be his wife or some woman that he's interested in. And he's saying like, oh, her eyes aren't that great. Her lips aren't that red. Her skin's not that white. Her hair isn't that soft. She doesn't really have rosy cheeks. Her breath kind of smells. I like hearing her speak, but music sounds better. She's definitely not a goddess. But in the end, he switches it around, right? And he says, "Yet by heaven I think my love is rare as any she belied with false compare." And so this is something you typically see in a sonnet, where the sonnet kind of starts saying one thing, but then there's a shift. And at the end, it says something different, right? And so this is, even though it sounds like at the beginning that he's kind of being insulting, he's saying that, even though there are these flaws, even though she's not perfect, I think that this love is probably one of the best ones there are. And that turn is a really powerful emotional move, because it's accepting imperfection, which is a kind of a cool concept. But anyway, this is a sonnet. 3 stanzas of 4 followed by 1 of 2. And then an A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G, rhyme scheme, and 10 syllables per line. I'm going to be asking you to make one of these, and I'll give you a little bit of help making it, so don't worry too much. And so, like I was mentioning earlier, it's written in iambic pentameter, right? So if we look at this first stanza, you can see that it's broken into more or less 10 syllables per line. If we were to look at this, it would be unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. And I'm not going to test you on that. All I will look for is, 10 syllables in the line. Good enough. You will probably accidentally write in iambic pentameter just by making this, but it's not required. Okay, and so that's the sonnet. And once again, feel free to review other videos, go back and watch this if you need more help writing this. I'll give you a kind of framework to help you create this poem later. The other structured form of fixed poem that I want you to know is what's called a villanelle. And this is going to sound super confusing when I explain it right now. But then when we actually look at it, you'll be like, okay, that doesn't seem quite as different, right? And so this form uses rhyme, repetition, and structure. It has 5 stanzas of 3 lines called tercets, and a 4-line quatrain at the end. The first and third line of each stanza rhyme, and the second line of every single stanza rhymes with the second line of every single stanza. There are several repeated phrases throughout the poem, and the end of the second and the fourth stanzas are the same as the first line of the poem, and the end of the first, third, and fifth stanzas are the same. And so it ends up making this rhyme scheme where it's ABA every time. But you can see this line here, AB1, is repeated here and here and here. And this line here, AB2, is repeated here, here, and here. And these lines are just A's. And so now that I've completely lost you, let me just show you what this looks like, because then you'll be like, oh, okay, it makes much more sense when you just show me. And so we have this extremely famous poem called "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night" by Dylan Thomas. It reads, "Do not go gentle into the good night. Old age should burn and rave at the close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know the dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men at the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in the green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death who see the blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now in your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Guys, one of these days, you'll have to find somebody who actually knows how to read poetry to have them read these to you. I don't do any of these poems justice by the way I read them. I'm just not used to reading poems out loud. But that being said, let me color code this so this makes a little bit more sense. This is what's called a villanelle. Now, you'll notice that there are certain parts of the poem that are just repeated over and over again, right? Do not go gentle into the good night. The first line of the poem is repeated at the end of this stanza, the end of this stanza, and the second to last line here. This line, rage, rage against the dying of the light, is repeated on every other stanza, right? And then the second line of each stanza, pray, gay, way, bay, they, and day, all rhyme with each other. This is what's called a villanelle, okay? And so it's a 3-line stanza repeated 5 times, and then a 4-line stanza at the end, but 2 of those 4 lines are just the original 2 lines from the poem. And so this is another form of structured poetry. And so once you come up with this first stanza, most of the rest of your poem is written for you, right? You just need to come up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 more original lines. And you've already decided what the rhyme scheme is going to be, because you can see that these words, sight, flight, bright, right, all rhyme with the original A rhyme scheme. And so this is called a villanelle. And if we look at, once again, the instructions here, you can see now what I was talking about, right? It has 5 stanzas of 3 lines and a 4-line quatrain at the end. The first and third line of each stanza have to rhyme. The second line of each stanza rhymes with each other second line of every stanza. The repeated phrases are at the end of the second and fourth stanza. They repeat the exact line of the first stanza, and then the end of the first, third, and fifth stanzas are the same. And so this was just a kind of poetry notation way of showing what my color coding here is showing. And so this is a villanelle. And once again, I will create kind of a template to help you out with writing this when we do this as a practice. Now, there's a couple more poetic concepts I want you to understand. This repeated line, where you repeat the same thing over and over again, this is what's called anaphora. And this can be used even if you're writing free verse and you're not writing a fixed form, you can use anaphora in your poetry, right? And this is when you just repeat a line over and over again. And typically, sometimes what it does is the context of the poem shifts, and every stanza makes that repeated line means something slightly different, and it could be a really interesting thing to use in your poem, right? And so anaphora is just a fancy way of saying you're repeating the same phrase in your poem. And so if we go back to the poem Virtue that we read earlier in the lesson, you can see that George Herbert uses anaphora at the end of most of his stanzas, right? For thou must die, for thou must die, for thou must die, then chiefly lives. And so you can see the repetition of thou must die kind of sets him up to have the opposite and say lives in the last line. And so this is another example of anaphora where he's just repeating the same thing. Now, all of these structured forms should be seen as contrast to free verse, right? And so free verse is what most people nowadays in modern poetry write. It doesn't have any structure. It doesn't have any rhythm. It's mainly using line breaks to enhance the meaning, and the poet puts the line break at the end of whatever kind of thought they're trying to punctuate, right? And so the poetry is just broken up by different lines that have slightly different meaning. And this is free verse, and by and large, this is what I see most of my students write in. And so I want to contrast this to the fixed forms. Free verse doesn't have any rules like the fixed forms do. And it's perfectly fine to be a free verse poet, right? I prefer free verse like 100% to all the other different forms of poetry. But that's just my preference. There's going to be some of you who really love writing in fixed form, writing in rhythm, and writing with some more rules to your poetry. And so here's an example of an ironic poem called Sonnet by Billy Collins. If you've been watching my lessons, you've seen me mention Billy Collins multiple times. And here he writes, all we need is 14 lines. Well, 13 now. And after this one, just a dozen to launch a little ship on love's storm-tossed seas. Then only 10 more left like rows of beans. How easily it goes unless you get Elizabethan and insist on the iambic bongos must be played. The rhythms positioned at the end of the lines, one for every station of the cross. But hang on. Here we will make the turn into the final 6 where it all must be resolved, where longing and heartache will find an end, where Laura will tell Petrarch to put down his pen, take off those crazy medieval tights, blow out the lights, and the last come to bed. And so here you'll see that Billy Collins is writing a 14-line poem, and he calls it a sonnet, but you'll see that it's missing some of the main features of a sonnet. First off, it doesn't have a rhyme scheme. There's no rhymed lines at the end. It doesn't have 10 syllables per line. It's not written in iambic pentameter, something he makes fun of when he says, and insists the iambic bongos must be played, right? If we look at this line, it's, and after this one, just a dozen. That's 9 syllables, right? And so it's not written in the regular meter. It's not written in the regular meter. And so this isn't truly a sonnet. This is more of just a free verse poem that slightly resembles a sonnet while making fun of sonnets. Welcome to Billy Collins. Here, we can see that, he's really kind of just also admiring, yet also making fun of a sonnet. And so let's take a look at the essential vocabulary and ask ourselves, okay, what do I remember and what don't I remember, right? Hopefully you remember what a syllable is. You have a vague idea of the concept of emphasis on the lines. Meter, which is how many beats per line. Rhythm is where those stressed beats are in the meter. Scansion, which is the way you go through a poem and try to find the rhythm and meter. There's the different rhythms such as iambs, trochees, anapasts, dactyls, and spondees. Most importantly, I would say make sure you know syllable. Make sure you have a vague idea of what these things are. I want you to know what free verse, stanzaic form, fixed form, sonnet, villanelle, and anaphora are. This is really the important list. I really should have taken blank verse off here. I didn't talk about it. But hopefully you know what these words all mean here, because we're going to go into our homework and practice assignment, and that is going to be writing an original sonnet and an original villanelle. And I'll talk more about that when we go look at the assignment. Hello, everybody, and let's take a look at our Lesson 6 practice assignment for rhythm and structure. So pretty much the purpose of this is I want you to get used to and I want you to practice several different types of structured poetry, right? And so if you're really interested in writing raps, songs, or any kind of classical poetry, this is a really useful skill to have. Not all poets will use this, but they should be aware of this form of poetry. And so the general assignment is you're going to write 2 fixed form poems, a sonnet and a villanelle. And I have the rules of the sonnet and the villanelle here. But more importantly, if you scroll down the paper, I have 2 little frameworks to help you out here in writing your 2 poems, right? And so for the sonnet, we have this little grid here, and each of these boxes represents 1 syllable, right? And so this is our first stanza of 4 lines. Each line is 10 syllables. Second stanza, third stanza, fourth. And so your goal would be make sure that you have 10 syllables per line, and at the end of the words rhyme in an A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G rhyme scheme, right? And so the way you could fill this out, and if you really want to challenge these gray boxes here, These would be the stressed syllables. If you want to take on the extra challenge of attempting to write an iambic pentameter, where it's unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, to make that da-dun, 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 da-dun rhythm. But that's not required. All I'm looking for really is 10 syllables. And I think that will be just fine. And so if I were to fill this out with some random things, I would say it's one syllable, am, ran, the writing in this box, right? I am randomly writing in this box. That's not on rhythm, but yeah. Anyway, it is 10 syllables, right? And so you'll notice that it's not one word per box, it's just one syllable per box. So once I have this, I would probably go to this line and be like, okay, what do I want to rhyme with box, right? And so let's say I'm going to end that one with socks, right? And that can be a way to be like, okay, how am I going to make this line end in socks? This is just ridiculous nonsense that I'm putting in here. But if you were to fill it out this way, it can oftentimes make the hassle of writing a sonnet a little bit easier. And then when you're done and you have the whole thing complete in this framework, it'd be nice to have it copied and pasted in like actual poetic form written below the poem. And so this little framework can make it a lot easier to write a sonnet. Going down here, I have a little helper with the villanelle. And you can see really what I'd recommend is first writing the first stanza. And so if you write the first stanza and you say something like, this poem is going to be most truly epic. God, what would rhyme with epic? I don't know. Awesome. What's a better rhyming word, right? You got to think when you're doing this. Oh, like, okay, am I setting myself up for an easy rhyme here, or am I not? Because every first and third line has to have a rhyme. So it's truly rad, right? Sometimes poets can be very sad, right? This is a lame poem. I'm not trying to make good poetry here, but anyway, you guys should be. So what I would do at that point, once I have this first stanza, is I'd copy this and put it in the other spots where it's supposed to be repeated in a villanelle, right? And then once I have this line, I can copy this and put it in the other required spots for the villanelle. And now we have the repeated parts of the villanelle written, and you would just pretty much need to write the additional lines where every second line should rhyme with every second line, and then the first line should still have the rhyme scheme of the A and the A spot, right? And so these things can help you to write your poems. Is it required that you use them? No, but I think using them will definitely help you to get these right the first time without any mistakes. Once again, feel free to ask me any questions when you get in class. If you need me to check out your poems or give you additional help, this assignment is just all about making a sonnet and a villanelle. I look forward to seeing what you guys write. And once again, just let me know if you have questions or you need help. Have a good day.